So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to. Okay, sorry. Let me just. We are having some technical difficulties to see the slides, so please. Can we go back to the beginning of the slides? Okay. So, good afternoon. My name is Elisa Giuliani. I'm a full professor of management here at the Department of Economics and Management of the University of Pisa. And welcome to these events, Rights Under Siege, Business Development and Responsibility in Palestine. This event has been co-organized by myself and colleagues here at the department. Some of them are here today, and they will moderate this session. The idea of this seminar started because we wanted to. Yes, okay. So I need to see how this works because my slides are not visible. So we need my slides, please, if you can upload them. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so this lecture today is part of the activities that we have carried out as within the Rebalance Observatory, which is part of a project that has been funded by the European Union as part of the Horizon Europe framework. And the idea of today's lecture is basically coming within a course that I teach at the Department of Economics and Management, and this course is the International Marketing and Management within the MBE undergraduate program, which is an English undergraduate program called Management for Business and Economics that is organized by my department. And in the course of International Management and Marketing, what I teach is, and what we teach is not just about how companies and international businesses make profits as they internationalize and operate across boundaries, but also, and more importantly, we discuss how companies can navigate the complexities of the international ecosystem, given that there are different institutions, different cultures, and different characteristics across the world, how companies navigate across these diversities. And one of the elements of that characterizes our lectures is about the discussion of the responsibility of businesses, precisely because international businesses operate across different countries that are very diverse, some of them with very weak institutions, some of them, as we will discuss today, in conflict areas. What is the responsibility of businesses and what can be a responsible business? And in the context of this, we talked a lot in the course, and some of my students are here, about human rights. We have had quite significant discussions, I would say, on human rights and the business, how companies, and what are the responsibilities of companies vis-a-vis human rights. And we have had not just discussed the notion of human rights, but also ethical decision-making. And this has not just been an abstract discussion, a theoretical discussion, but within the course, we also refer to concrete cases. So, for instance, some of the group works which we have organized in class have concerned specific countries like Myanmar or other conflict regions or places where there are wars, and what companies and international businesses have to do in those contexts, how they should behave in a responsible way, and what is the relationship that they should have with domestic firms. And the relevance of human rights is not a minor issue within an international management and marketing course, because human rights infringement related to the business sector are not infringed and are not infrequent, And let me just here spend a couple of minutes on some of the results of a recent project, which I mentioned at the beginning, that is part of the Rebalance Observatory research, which we have carried out here in Pisa, where we have tracked for 20 years the human rights infringements of a sample of 83 among the largest multinational enterprises in Europe. And we have tried to identify individual evidence of their involvement in human rights and environmental abuses. This you see a map here on the right, and these are like the places where the abuses of these 83 companies that we have tracked over 20 years have been perpetrated, at least in the documented evidence that we found. And interestingly, we have been able to identify over 4,300 abusive events connected only to these 83 companies. And also interestingly, 98% of the monitored companies have at least are linked to at least one abuse of human rights over the period of observation. So you see these companies, just 83 companies coming from Europe, having or being associated with abuses all over the world in over 145 countries. So that means human rights misbehavior by the business sector is not a minor thing. It's something worthwhile of consideration and certainly need to be part of the training of future managers and anyone who think about working in a company or for a company or being an entrepreneur. So clearly that brings us, and then with that we land on the topic of today. Why Palestine is a case to be discussed in an international management class. Certainly there are two elements. Of course, we are all aware of the war. We are all aware of the striking situation that, I mean, it's on the press, it's been discussed widely over the last year or so. So clearly we are all aware of the situation, but there were two elements for which we thought that it was the right time to bring an academic discussion about this topic today within the course. First of all, the report from Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide, where clearly the Palestine and Gaza situation have been discussed in connection to international business. And so that raised a number of red flags. Maybe there is something we should discuss or something we should have a conversation about what the role of international businesses has been or is in the context of the Palestinian territories. And in connection to that, we also think it's very important to look at what's happening to domestic firms and to the domestic economy. And also, as everywhere else in the world, in Pisa there have been, over the last year, a lot of demonstrations for Palestine. And clearly that means that there is some kind of interest among the students and among the local population. So both elements brought me to think that it was a great idea to have a discussion and to have a lecture on this during the course. So for this reason, we organized today's lecture. We have quite an impressive lineup of speakers. They're all experts on the subject matter. So today's is organized into sessions that will be moderated by my two colleagues, Verdiana Morreale and Elena Assenza. Session 1 is about the responsibilities of international business. So we have two speakers, Chiara Macchi from Wageningen University and Kelsall from SOAS, University of London. And the second session will be on the local economy and also on the prospect of reconstruction. So the role of the economy, the role of business in this aspect. And here we have in connection, in remote connection, Luigi Bisceglia from Bethlehem University and Tara Van Ho from San Antonio, Texas University. So without further ado, I will now leave the floor to the moderators of the first session and then to the speakers who I thank for being with us today.
Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the first session of today's seminar entitled Responsibility in International Business. In this session, we will explore how corporate conduct intersects with the situation of grave human rights violations. The specific focus on Palestine will delve us into the evolving debates around corporate responsibility, complicity, and the application of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Our first speaker is Chiara Macchi, Assistant Professor of International Law at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, who will examine how the UNGPs operate as a soft law standard to assess corporate involvement in what has been described as an economy of occupation and genocide in the occupied Palestinian territory, highlighting the implications of causation, contributions, and linkage for corporate responsibility. And we will have 20 minutes for the presentation and 10 minutes for questions and answers. And thank you, Chiara. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Verdiana, and thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be able to speak at this event in my hometown, incidentally, and also at my alma mater, because many, many years ago, I was also a student at UNIP. Today, for a smooth division of labor with Michelle, I will mostly focus on corporate responsibility in the context of occupation, leaving it to Michelle to focus more on the specific issue of genocide. And I think some of you in the audience are already familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But just to give a short introduction, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011 are a soft law instrument, non-binding instruments, but very authoritative, widely endorsed by states and corporations, which for the first time affirmed that even corporations have human rights responsibilities. And this requires them to check their own operations, but also their global value chains, to identify their risk of being directly or indirectly involved in human rights impacts, negative impacts. So they must make sure that they are not directly causing or contributing to human rights violations with their own activities, but they also need to check that they are not indirectly linked to negative human rights impacts, for instance, through their supply chain relationships. The process of human rights due diligence is the process that allows company to identify and address those impacts. And in some cases, it also requires company to contribute in the remediation of the negative impacts that they have directly contributed to. Now, this is in all circumstances, and this is true for all companies of all sizes and sectors. However, of course, when it comes to volatile context, unstable context, such as the context of conflict, occupation, genocide, systematic human rights violations, then the UN tells us that companies have a heightened human rights due diligence responsibility. In this context, human rights due diligence must not be limited to identifying the company's human rights impacts, but it must look more broadly at the company's link with the conflict dynamics. So the company needs to understand the context and especially ask itself, to what extent are my operations contributing to sustaining or exacerbating the conflict dynamics or the genocide dynamics or the systematic human rights violations. So it is very context specific, and it requires taking into consideration a broader legal framework as well, because in the context of conflict and occupation, the law of occupation comes into being. So international humanitarian law, the law applicable in times of war, becomes relevant, and companies must also be very aware of international criminal law, because some of these companies are at a high risk of involvement, of complicity in international crimes. And as you can see on the right side of this slide, a number of companies have already been sued for alleged complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity in several countries. And these lawsuits are now ongoing. And then sometimes conducting human rights due diligence also means accepting the fact that no amount of due diligence is in certain contexts can mitigate the risk of being involved in serious human rights violations. The UN has underlined, the UN Human Rights Council has underlined a few years ago that in the context of the occupied Palestinian territory, some of the impacts are clearly unmitigable, which means that the only option for companies that are linked to or contributing to those abuses is to exit, to cease the business relationship, to operate elsewhere, to just leave that context of operations and business relationships. Now, when it comes, of course, to the occupied Palestinian territories, there is ample evidence that certain business activities are of high concern when it comes to human rights. This has been sanctioned in the 2020 UN database on business activities in the Israeli settlements, which has been updated in 2025 and now comprises of 158 business enterprises that are involved in what the UN considers to be activities of high concern from a human rights perspective. And we will see some examples of that. And then, of course, there is the 2025 report of the UN Special Rapporteur that Elisa was referring to. And here as well, we have tens of corporate actors that are cited as being involved in the economy of occupation and genocide. And these are companies from many sectors. So not only the usual suspects, so the military sector, defense, arms, or surveillance, but also extractives, agriculture, tourism, and even some academic institutions. So the context of the occupied Palestinian territory is, of course, a very high-risk context. It is a context of systematic violation of international law and international human rights law. The 2024 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice has affirmed very strongly that Israel's occupation in the OPT is illegal. Every minute of this occupation is an internationally wrongful act. It violates the peremptory norm of international law of the prohibition of force in international relations, and the corollary principle which prohibits the appropriation of territory in the context of occupation. And actually, the International Court of Justice has recognized that Israel's practices amount to unlawful annexation of territory in the context of an illegal occupation. The Israeli settlements are also illegal under international humanitarian law, which prohibits the transferring of the occupying powers' civilian population into the occupied territory. This is very relevant. This context is very relevant for companies because, of course, in this context, we see the systematic appropriation and exploitation of property and natural resources that belong to the Palestinian people. And this means that not only Israeli companies, but also international companies are using resources that are diverted from the Palestinian population and exploited in the service of the illegal settlement and at the expense of the Palestinian population. This also is a violation of international law. Some of the companies involved in these activities might be involved in the crime of pillage under international law, for instance. There is a violation of the long-standing principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources that belong to the occupied population. But also, because Palestinians are prevented from accessing their own natural resources and through the practice of home demolition that the Israeli authorities carry out, there is also a problem of forcible transfer of the civilian population, which is de facto prevented from living on their territory because they don't have access to resources and they are deprived of their own homes. Now, companies can contribute to the perpetuation of this illegal situation by providing the goods, the services, the infrastructure that are used to demolish Palestinian property, to expand the illegal settlements, to exploit the resources for the benefit of the occupying power in defiance of international law. Because this situation is unlawful under international law, the illegal occupation creates an illegal situation. International law, and the ICJ has reaffirmed that, also requires third states, so for instance, Italy, France, the US, to not recognize the illegal situation and not assist the illegal situation, enabling its perpetuation, its continuation. Well, the UN General Assembly has also remarked that states must also ensure that their own nationals and their own companies and all the entities domiciled within their jurisdiction act in a way that contributes to giving recognition and assistance to this illegal situation. This has not happened in most cases. And nowadays, we still see many companies involved in what are likely to be grave human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory. In the UN database that I was mentioning earlier on business activities in the OPT, in the illegal Israeli settlements, there are some activities that are listed as particularly problematic from an international law perspective. For instance, the supply of equipment and materials used for the expansion of the illegal settlements, but also those used for demolishing Palestinian property and houses. Another problematic activity is the use of natural resources, such as water and land, but also mineral resources for commercial gain. The supply of surveillance and identification equipment for the settlements, for the wall, for the checkpoints. And these are some clear examples of that. So the German company Heidelberg Materials operates quarries in the West Bank, in the Area C, which means that it exploits the occupied land and the resources of the Palestinian people for commercial gain in the same area in which Palestinian companies have been denied quarrying permits since 1994. So the Palestinians are not allowed by the Israeli authorities to mine their own minerals or other natural resources, but a German corporation like Heidelberg Materials is allowed to do that. Now, this probably integrates the international crime of pillage, and Heidelberg Materials is definitely contributing to serious human rights violations, but maybe even causing those human rights violations with its own quarrying activities. Netafim is an Israeli company, the subsidiary of a Mexican firm, and they provide irrigation systems to the Israeli settlements, in particular to their farms, which means that the water belonging to the Palestinians is diverted to the irrigation of the farms of the illegal Israeli settlements. This, of course, deprives the Palestinian population from access to water and pushes them out of the market because they cannot compete with the Israeli farms, with the settlers' farms. Caterpillar, this is well known, they have been supplying bulldozers for many years to the Israeli authorities, knowing all too well that those bulldozers are used, for instance, to demolish Palestinian homes and property. And this is definitely a direct contribution to the destruction of civilian property and to human rights violations. The Israeli Elbit systems supplies equipment, surveillance equipment to the Israeli authority, and then this equipment, for instance, drones and other forms of surveillance, are used to spy on the Palestinians, to carry out targeted attacks on the civilian population, and so on. So this is a contribution to systematic human rights violations. But it's important to underline that all sectors potentially can contribute to the economic viability of an illegal enterprise, such as the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Just to make some examples, what about the European supermarkets that keep selling settlement-grown products, for instance, dates, lemons, tomatoes, avocados, peppers, and so on? Well, some European supermarkets keep selling these products that are grown in the illegal Israeli settlements, where they are produced on stolen land with stolen resources and so on. And very often they market these products not transparently, but labeling them as a produce of Israel, or a produce of the West Bank, or a produce of Palestine even, whereas they were actually grown on illegally occupied land. So this is a problem. It is definitely something that links these European supermarkets to the violation of the Palestinian human rights, but it is also problematic from a consumer perspective, because in defiance of what the Court of Justice of the European Union has affirmed in 2019, very often these products are not clearly labeled as grown in the illegal Israeli settlements. So also for consumers, this is a problem. Then, of course, Booking.com and Airbnb, they list properties in Israeli settlements. In this way, they contribute to normalizing the settlements. Sometimes they market these properties, again, as located in Israel, whereas they are not located in Israel, but on the land of the Palestinians. And in so doing, they contribute to human rights violations. And this has actually led to several lawsuits that are still pending in France, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in the UK. For instance, in France, these companies are accused of complicity and aggravated concealment of war crimes. In other jurisdictions, they are accused of money laundering because they are, of course, making a profit from a violation of international law. So we will see how these cases will go, but this involvement sometimes does lead to lawsuits and to potential liability. It is important to underline that there is no way that in 2025 these companies can deny being aware of the risk of being involved in serious human rights violations when they operate in the OPT or with businesses that operate in the OPT. Companies must know, they must be aware, because of the immense amount of evidence of violations that has been gathered throughout the years, not only by journalists, civil society, and independent organizations, but also by the UN itself. And then companies should know, and they should know because under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it is their clear responsibility to know what goes on in their operations and global supply chains. So they must find out, they must assess the risk of being involved in serious human rights abuses. If they don't know that they are potentially linked or contributing to abuses in the OPT, is because they have not carried out their enhanced human rights due diligence in a correct manner. And this can actually also lead to liability, because in some European countries, human rights due diligence has been made binding by law. So, for instance, in Germany, the German media company Axel Springer is being sued under the German Act on due diligence obligations in supply chains because allegedly it is contributing to the rental and sale of Palestinian property in the illegal Israeli settlements through its Israeli platform, Israeli subsidiary, a platform that indeed facilitates the rental and sale of property. Let me conclude with 2 words about the responsibility of the financial sector, because of course many of these companies and projects receive funding or lending from banks, from institutional investors. Well, institutional investors and banks could be contributing to human rights violations if they keep investing in these companies. But they can, for instance, if they hold a minority share in one of these companies, perhaps they are not directly contributing to the abuses caused by those companies, but they might still be linked to those abuses. This, under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, requires exercising human rights due diligence. And if nothing else works, the bank or the institutional investor might have as the last resort option, the only option to divest from those companies or from those projects. In 2024, finally, the Norwegian pension fund has decided, for instance, to divest from Caterpillar and from 5 Israeli banks that have for many years funded the expansion of the illegal Israeli settlements. The Norwegian pension fund, institutional investors, has recognized that there is an acceptable risk that these companies are contributing to serious violations of human rights, and therefore they have divested. Unfortunately, it took them many years, too many years. Let me just conclude by saying that heightened human rights due diligence is needed in a context such as the occupied Palestinian territory, and in most cases the only credible step that companies can take in this context is to cease operating in the OPT or to cut ties with entities that are violating human rights in the OPT. Under the UN Guiding Principles, companies are required to act. They are required to conduct human rights due diligence regardless of any obligation of public law. But let's keep in mind that in some states, and probably soon also at the European Union level, big companies are already subjected to mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. So it is also a requirement of law. And this responsibility under the UNGPs, and in part also a legal obligation, exists regardless of the smokescreen of ESG ratings that, as you might have heard, in some cases have excluded the OPT and the abuses connected with the OPT from their controversy rating, and therefore you can find companies with stellar ESG ratings which hide the fact that they are actually involved in serious human rights violations in the OPT. So that was all from my side. Thank you very much for the attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Our second speaker is Michelle Kelsall, Senior Lecturer in International Law at School of Oriental and African Studies of University of London. And after Chiara's presentation, her presentation connects the UNGPs with the Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, analyzing the role of companies and home states in preventing genocide and assessing how corporate complicity may be established in light of past and current corporate engagement with Israel. Thank you, Michelle. The floor is yours.
Grazie. Mi dispiace molto, non parlo italiano e posso comunicare con te solo tramite Google Translate. So that's all for me in the Italian. I would love to speak Italian and to be able to speak more to you. But I guess the proceedings have been in English, so I will continue with that trend. Thank you so much to the organizers of this workshop for including me on this panel. As already mentioned by Professor Elisa, I'm Dr. Michelle Staggs-Kelsall. I'm coming to you from London, from SOAS. And in keeping with what Dr. Chiara has already outlined for you, my presentation is really looking at how we can understand what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories through the prism of genocidal acts and the obligation to prevent genocide in Palestine. And I'm drawing, as was already mentioned, specifically on the work of Francesca Albanese, the current Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories since 1967. And that date will become important because that is where the occupation by Israel of those territories is understood at the UN level to have begun. So I just want to check I'm keeping to time. 20 minutes, yeah? Ah, perfecto. Thank you. So, oh, it's like this? Ah, okay. So the first thing I want to ask you, how many of you have heard of the Genocide Convention? Can you raise your hand? Okay, Genocide Convention. Okay, so it's important that I explain what I am discussing today. It is a convention for the prevention and punishment of genocide that came into being, or was originally came into, was ratified in 1948. So in other words, member states in 1948 agreed to become part of this convention, or to agree this convention. And the reason why they agreed to the convention in 1948 was in the aftermath of World War II, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. A person named Raphael Lemkin wanted to help define a crime, to express and explain what had happened to the Jewish people during World War II. And Lemkin, in addition to wanting to respond to that mass and grave atrocity, was also concerned with historic examples of this having occurred prior to that time, particularly in Armenia, earlier that century. And in 1948, states parties agreed in the aftermath of the Charter of the United Nations, where member states became part of the UN, to establish this convention. And the primary prosecuting principle, or the primary part of the convention that leads to prosecution, is proving the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, any national, racial, ethnical, or religious group as such. And there are different parameters for how you would prove that intent, on the one hand, to destroy, and the manner, the acts that occur for the group to be destroyed. And at present, 152 states parties out of 193 member states have ratified or acceded to this convention, which means that they have agreed that they will abide by the laws that are part of the convention, the treaty obligations, as we call it in international law. It's a treaty. One state party, the Dominican Republic, has only signed, and 41 states are non-parties. And it's a spread between Africa, Asia, and America, 6 from America, 17 from Asia, and around 12, I believe, from Africa, who are as yet to be states parties. But as you can see, the vast majority of the globe has ratified this convention, which means that states have committed to be obligated to the aspects of the convention. So why does this matter to you as business and management students? Are you mostly from management? How many of you are here doing business or management? Put your hands up. Oh. Any political scientists? No? Sociology? Law? Okay, so most of you are actually interested in economics. So Francesca Albanese, in her report of earlier this year, in June of this year, outlined and detailed how the occupation of Palestine, and in particular of Gaza, but also the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which are the occupied Palestinian territories, was essentially enabling a form of economy upon which the resources of the Palestinian people were being essentially utilized by Israel to continue to perpetuate the violence against those people. She notes in particular, drawing from an opinion by the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is the apex court of the United Nations. So it's the top court in the international law. And essentially they issued an advisory opinion responding to the question of the legality of the occupation of Israel in Palestine. And what the court determined was that the prolonged occupation, the prolonged presence of Israel in Palestine. Israel has been in Palestine since 1967 to 2025. Essentially, in the whole of the territory was itself illegal. And it was stifling the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian ability to maintain its own resources and trade and investment. It also based this illegality on sustained violations of 2 peremptory norms of international law, one being the right to self-determination of a people. Essentially, what the norm of self-determination means is that peoples across the globe should have the right themselves to determine that they wish to form a political community and subsequently a state. And this ongoing occupation in Palestine was essentially violating that norm. And in addition, the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force, as Dr. Chiara mentioned in some detail. As a result of this violation of these 2 norms, they were institutionalizing a monopoly over the resources of those territories. And they were creating a captive market by doing so in both labor, utilizing either Palestinian labor by taking resources away from the Palestinians that themselves had engaged in creating them, or by utilizing the land to plant their own resources. And it also further recognized the violation of the norm prohibiting racial segregation and apartheid, because essentially, in addition to taking resources from the Palestinians, the state of Israel is also ensuring that Israelis can come onto the land, and as a result, creating a form of racial segregation between Israelis on the one hand, Israeli Jews on the one hand, and Palestinians on the other. And they were financing this illegal occupation by utilizing a neutralizing ideology, as Dr. Chiara mentioned, essentially stating that goods and services produced in this manner could be exported without mentioning or explaining or explicitly determining how they had been found. So this system is what Francesca Albanese in her report argues results in an ongoing displacement and replacement of the Palestinian people prior to October 7, 2023 and thereafter. So what's interesting about Dr. Albanese's report is that she shows how the occupation itself creates the conditions for the genocidal acts which occur after October 7. And she says that corporations, business enterprises, are materially contributing to this displacement and replacement, or they are enabling it through the ongoing destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, places of leisure and worship, livelihoods, and the confiscation of productive assets, which I've listed some there, to segregate and control the communities and restrict access to the resources during this time. So how does that then result in an economy of genocide? And I should add at this point, seeing as you're economists, that several international economists or economists from outside of Israel have endorsed or have said that her report is very much based on a sound and rigorous analysis, including Joseph Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty. So essentially, what's happening is that existing technologies, weapons, and heavy machinery that were already being utilized during Israel's occupation are now being repurposed toward obliterating the urban landscape of Gaza and preventing displaced populations of Palestinians from returning to the land and reconstituting as a community. And she identifies 12 key culprit sectors, some of which Chiara has already mentioned, that essentially give rise or enable this displacement, replacement, and enabling of Israel to continue these acts. Oh, I'm not sure what's happening. So with respect to displacement, she looks in particular at the military assistance that is given to Israel through international weapons manufacturers, including the F-35 fighter jet components. And I've named there the companies that Dr. Albanese mentions in her report, including Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace, Defense Industries, Lockheed Martin, Leonardo SPA, which is an Italian company, and Fanuc Corporation. Technology has also played a very important part in how the acts have continued, in part because the databases that are maintained on the Palestinian population enable then targeting to occur of those people and provide tech infrastructure as well as enhanced data processing. And that's included these companies here. Microsoft has since withdrawn its support for at least part of its systems being utilized by Israel. But IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Alphabet, and Apple continue to work in Israel. Additionally, heavy machinery, dual-use tools of settler colonial occupation. So essentially, as Dr. Macchi also mentioned, Caterpillar, Hyundai, Doosan, and Volvo Group, those machineries are actually being used to raise Palestinian lands and demolish homes. It's coming.
Okay, it's a bit slow.
It's just a bit slow, so I keep pressing. Yeah. So we have replacement. So once we have displaced the population and demolished the homes, there comes construction for what Dr. Albanese notes are the occupiers of the land, 371 colonies currently in the West Bank and Gaza. In addition to companies listed above, that includes Heidelberg Materials and also Construcciones Auxiliar de Ferrocarril, a Spanish company. And real estate is being then sourced to those entering the lands by Keller Williams Realty. And natural resources are then being essentially drawn out of areas in Gaza. So water, for example, has been cut off through various pipelines that are, of course, been established by Mekorot, and electricity also from coal and gas, and exploitation of the Palestinian territorial waters is ongoing, including these companies here. Similarly, agribusiness has been a major part of denying the Palestinian people the right to food by determining how that food is administered from an Israeli perspective or Israeli side. Similarly, global market retailers support retail supermarket chains, and occupation tourism, as already mentioned from Booking.com and Airbnb, have formed part of a replacement economy. So essentially enabling the colonies that have emerged to engage in acts which would ensure their ongoing prosperity to the detriment of the Palestinian people. So how is this then enabled? In addition to financing the activities of Israel and the Israeli state, there has also been a facilitation of bond issuances, which have increased from 8 billion in March 2024 from prior to that date, and then subsequently again for 5 billion in February 2025. In other words, investors can then buy bonds which are being utilized, the funds from those investments are being utilized to fund and finance the acts which are being committed. And Barclays Bank and BNP Paribas have been underwriting those issuances. Similarly, institutional investors continue to engage in investing in Israel, which has further enabled the government to engage in such acts. And benchmarking indices, global insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and public not-for-profits both add credibility to the issuances, encouraging investment through benchmark indices, and also further underwrite investments through global insurance. The sovereign wealth funds themselves, in particular pension funds, have been essentially profiting off the bonds that have been issued or the acts that are being committed by Israel through secondary sources. Since this time, the Norwegian government pension fund has withdrawn its support for the companies in question. Similarly, public and not-for-profit faith-based charities continue to support Israeli communities and Israel's acts that are occurring, and also to some extent universities continue to support research which has resulted in the genocide able to be occurring. So what then is the relationship between these things? Why am I setting this out for you? Well, what I'm really looking at in this paper, and which I've started to explain to you here, is that there's a relationship between the prolonged occupation and enabling of these industries and business enterprises to continue to perpetuate the acts which are occurring by Israel during that period to racially segregate the Palestinian population and remove goods and services and resources from them, toward what then becomes the acts which occur in the aftermath of October 7. It creates the context in which allegations of genocide and incitement to commit genocide have been put forward now in the case at the International Court of Justice in South Africa versus Israel. And what we see emerging from the allegations is that the actions and omissions that are committed are genocidal in character, as they're committed with the specific intent. Remember, I said at the beginning, a specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as part of a broader national, racial, and ethnical group. And we see this because of the non-discriminatory attacks on the Gazan population and the targeting of, in particular, of women and children who themselves do not pose any legitimate military objective or military threat. The conduct of Israel through its state organs and state agents, but also other persons and entities acting on instructions or under its direction or control or influence, are essentially in violation of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. So to very briefly, in the time I have left, just show you why this is important and how the companies themselves are essentially violating an obligation to prevent. While we cannot as yet determine punitive acts on the companies or their directors themselves, the obligation to prevent precedes any such trial, and all that needs to be required to bring this prevention obligation about is a serious risk that genocide will be committed, and that the state is obliged, if it has its capacity to influence, political links and proximity. But why should corporations care if it's only the state, according to the ICJ? Well, that's where we have to look at the obligation to prevent based on what the guiding principles say, which is that the states themselves must require companies to conduct appropriate due diligence, provide adequate assistance, deny access to public support and services, and ensure that policies and legislation. Yeah, I've only got 2 points more. Oh.
No, you have to point a bit more towards there.
Direction. Oh, okay. If only I'd known sooner. And why does it matter that the guiding principles say this? If we go back. Oh, sorry, I've gone forward. How do I get back to my? Could you? Thank you. If you could just put it on. Oh, we're back to. Okay. Just keep going. Yep. Yeah, stop here. Oh, no, keep going, actually. Oh, yeah? Yeah, cool. So as Chiara also already mentioned, the cause, contribution, and direct linkage of the corporations themselves essentially hold the businesses responsible for adverse human rights impacts. But in the situation where there's an obligation to prevent genocide, and that complicity in genocide can be understood to have been formed, each of these companies that I mentioned at the beginning have all established policy commitments and reports claiming that they have signed up to the guiding principles on business and human rights. Every single one of them, except for the agribusiness firms, have already essentially, as part of their commitment to the guiding principles agreed to respect human rights in their corporate responsibility initiative, and also have agreed to heightened human rights due diligence in conflict situations. And as a result, the obligation to prevent genocide under the Genocide Convention can now be exposing those companies to being complicit in genocide because of their public commitment to respect the guiding principles. And as a result, can I go back one, please?
Back is this one.
Okay. There are primary, secondary, and tertiary obligations to prevent genocide, which require an obligation to withdraw all support of persons committing genocidal acts, but additionally, secondary responsibility to engage in targeted interventions to assist in preventing ongoing acts from occurring. And this is a new area of research in that much of the discussion on prevention has not been, as of yet, fully drawn out from the case law. But we see in particular with the cases against Booking.com that these legal arguments are being made by SOMO and others in the Netherlands in particular. And I would argue that if we see the guiding principles themselves as a soft law instrument, but nevertheless having the capacity to form customary norms over time, we can adopt an approach that...
Sorry, Michelle, I can't invite you to conclude because we are out of time.
That remains true to the aims of the guiding principles themselves. I'd like to believe you then with a quote from Omar Bortov. It is time for the world to confront both the scale of the violence and its own enabling silence. Silence is no longer a possibility in the current situation. I think it's important that we all speak out against what is happening in Palestine and respond accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. Any questions from the audience?
So IMM students, please raise questions. Ask questions. Also the other students, of course. But mostly IMM because they are well trained on this subject.
Okay. I have a couple of questions for both, but maybe I can start only with one for each. Thank you very much. This was very interesting and important. My first question for Chiara is, sorry for the ignorance, but the occupied Palestinian territories include Gaza or not? Yes, they include, but they are also Jerusalem. Okay. Okay. And then my other question, also very out of ignorance, sorry, but when we hear, for example, don't listen into Spotify or don't buy Coca-Cola, this means that it's because these companies are financing directly Israeli operations or it's because they actually are in the West Bank or why? What is happening in these like cases? Not maybe Carrefour is more, you explained it already, but I wanted to know about this. Yeah, these cases. And then for Michelle, just to ask you a little bit more about this Genocide Convention. So it's a convention that when each country accepted it, it means that they cannot drop. Let's say that a political government comes into a country and they don't want to be any more part of the convention. Can they drop from there? And if you could elaborate a little bit more what it means non-parties countries. Because I'm from Argentina and I saw that maybe Argentina is one of these ones. So what this means, that they don't take part and, okay, just.
Yes, so when we talk about, of course, there has been a big boycott movement. It's been going on for many years, actually. It refers both to companies that operate in the occupied territory, but also to companies that do not directly operate there, but are linked very closely to activities that take place there. For instance, I remember Ben & Jerry's left the West Bank. They had some ice cream shops there. They decided to leave because these kind of activities enabled the economic viability of the illegal Israeli settlements. So although they would look innocuous by themselves, certain economic activities that take place in the illegally occupied territory actually enable the economy of this illegal occupation to flourish. So for some companies, indeed, it is an issue of being there. For other companies, they are or investors. They are not. For instance, I think the owner of Spotify was accused of holding shares in a problematic company. To be honest, I don't remember the details, but it was not the issue that he was operating there in any way. But the linkage was more geographically remote, as for most companies. But still, companies that enable these activities to take place, for instance, through funding. Or I made the example of supermarket buying and selling products grown in the Israeli illegal settlements. They are, according to the UNGPs, some of these companies will be contributing, so maybe you can even identify a causal link with the violations. Others are just linked to those violations, but still all of them have a responsibility to assess those risks. And in some cases, this requires leaving if you are operating in the OPT, or cutting business ties with those companies that are operating in the OPT in defiance of international human rights standards. So the boycott movement tries to grasp all of these modes of involvement, if you will. Some cases are more serious than others, I would say, but the idea is that indeed nobody can turn a blind eye and pretend that it's not their business because they are just doing business. In 2025, it's really impossible for any company to claim ignorance, even when they consider themselves to be just linked to the violations.
Yes, so just to answer the question about whether a state can withdraw, absolutely, it can at any point withdraw should it wish to do so. I don't know if you want any elaboration on that, but in terms of the non-states, that's essentially, as you already mentioned, it's those states that aren't currently a party. Yeah, thanks.
Are there any other questions from students? Please don't be shy. Yeah, sure.
I have a question, like in the first part you mentioned like certain companies are financing the terrorists and the jihadis. So what benefit do they get from financing these terrorist organizations? Yeah.
I made the example of the Lafarge-Holcim lawsuit in France. It was on the slide, actually. I didn't really talk about it, but there was a picture on the slide because it's an example of how companies and their managers or directors can be sometimes they can be sued. That there are attempts to hold some of them even criminally liable for their involvement in international crimes. Even in this case, it was Lafarge-Holcim, this French cement company that continued to operate in Syria throughout the civil war. And it was paying some sanctioned groups, including the ISIS. Why were they paying them? Because in this way, they would secure the security and the safety of the company's operations in Syria. So in exchange for security, they were giving money to terrorist groups. And this, of course, has been considered to be complicity in the crimes of those groups, that they were also financing terrorism. So they were breaching a number of laws, both at the international and at the domestic level in France. So they were actually sued in France, and I think the case is ongoing at the moment. But this was made as an example of what can happen when companies take their responsibilities too lightly when operating in this type of volatile, conflict-affected scenarios. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep.
We're part of an high school class, so I'm asking this out of pure ignorance, but since the last lecturer said that many of the UN laws are non-binding, my question was, what is the purpose of being part of the UN if you won't abide by its laws?
Challenging question. Do you want to go first, or I can? For instance, I can speak of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, because they are. So, first of all, why are there many non-legally binding instruments adopted at the UN level? Well, very often this choice is made when it's difficult to rely a consensus on binding norms, because of course certain issues might be very new or politically controversial. So the international community sometimes takes an incremental approach. For instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a soft law instrument, formally speaking, but then throughout the years, the consensus rallied around a number of binding treaties, so the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Covenant on the Rights of the Child, and these are binding instruments. But the first step was a soft law instrument, because first you have to bring the states at the table and negotiate some common guidelines or guiding principles, if you will. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are no different from them. There have been decades of debates about, can we affirm that corporations have human rights duties at the international level, and because corporations, unlike states, are not considered to be full international legal subjects. Most states and also many scholars consider it unsound to attribute to them directly binding human rights obligations at the international level. So this debate at some point reached a stalemate, and the only way to overcome this stalemate was to at least find some consensus around a non-binding instrument. And it is not by chance that the UNGPs talk about responsibilities for corporations and not obligations, precisely because there was this clash of opinions. And this is considered to be the first step towards at least agreeing that corporations are not off the hook when it comes to human rights. Based on this now, several states in Europe have adopted mandatory human rights due diligence laws. France, Germany, Norway. The EU was about to adopt a very, very good corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which is now unfortunately being watered down, although hopefully it will be adopted anyway in a weaker version. But this is just to say that sometimes you do start from soft law to then progress towards more binding law, and also to put certain subjects under the spotlight, because with the UNGPs, the debate about the responsibilities of corporations was heightened, was reignited. And this is the last comment that I'm going to make. For instance, the UNGPs have been used in the Netherlands by a court to find that Shell, the oil company Shell, has climate change obligations under Dutch law. Dutch law does not have a clear obligation for companies to mitigate their own climate change impact. But this court of law, based on the UNGPs and other soft law and binding standards at the international level, interpreted Dutch law as implying a duty to mitigate impact on climate change. So see that the soft law is not necessarily toothless or useless. It is just the first step towards something else. I don't know if you have comments.
Yeah, just to reiterate and expand on what Chiara has just said. I think the binding, non-binding is in a way, it's a misnomer or misunderstanding, in the sense that law becomes more binding on there's the treaties and the law on the books on the one hand. And I think because you're used to law in a normal, like in Italy, you have the legislature and you have the various arms. At the international level, that doesn't exist, right? We don't have that. So while we have treaties on the one hand, we also have norms that emerge. And that's just basically the practices of different parties, states for the most part. And essentially what that means is, like Chiara is saying, over time, the more people agree to do that norm, the more likely you are to have the ability then to hold them accountable to it. And that's what we're seeing now with the guiding principles. I mean, I am very critical of the guiding principles. I can tell you a lot of the reasons why I think they're problematic. But one of the things that I think is really good is that we now have hundreds of companies who've agreed that they believe it's their responsibility to do no harm. So it's our responsibility then to hold them to account for that and say, yeah, you said you were going to do no harm, so stop doing harm, which is what is happening in the courts.
Thank you so much to the speaker of the first session, Chiara and Michelle. Now I give the floor to Dr. Elena Assenza for this session, number 2.
So hi everyone. We finally made it to session 2 of today. So we have 2 amazing speakers that are joining us online. So I hope that they can hear us and see us and everything is working fine with the connection. So the first speaker that I'm happy to present is Professor Luigi Bisceglia. He's an assistant professor of business administration at Bethlehem University, and his presentation will focus on the Palestinian economy in the context of the Middle East conflict. So Professor Bisceglia, we're happy to have you here. Just as a reminder, you will have roughly 20 minutes to present, and then we will have some time for Q&A. I will let you know when you have roughly 5 minutes left. So I will now give the floor to Professor Bisceglia. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Professor Elisa, for inviting me. It is actually a pleasure and an honor to participate in this seminar for several reasons. The first one is the fact that we were able to establish, to build this bridge between Pisa and Bethlehem. And then at the same time, it's a pleasure for me to be back, even though online, remotely, to the University of Pisa, where I got my PhD in business administration. Now, I think it is important to give you some information about what happened in the past 2 years to the Palestinian economy, just because in this way we can better understand how serious is the situation. And I try to give you a picture of what is happening either in the West Bank and also in the Gaza Strip, and consider that in any case the Palestinian economy was never in the best possible shape, considering also what Dr. Chiara and Dr. Michelle explained to us. So let's say that in the past 15 years, there was anyway a modest economic progress that was basically canceled in the past 2 years. The real GDP fell back to the 2009 level. Consider, guys, that the nominal GDP per capita per person dropped to $2,600 US dollars per year. And then consider that even, the past 5 years were problematic because of the COVID-19 outbreak. And then because there are always, new shocks, because the political situation is very, very unstable. Then, of course, after the 7th of October, things deteriorated, in particular in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. And now we can say that we are not facing only an economic decline, but basically we can affirm that humanity was defeated. That's the reason why the situation is very serious. And I apologize. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay. Now, consider that the economic activities in Gaza basically collapsed. The GDP collapsed by more than 80% in 2024, and it declined for another 12% in the first quarter of 2025. The Gaza's share to the Palestinian economy has fallen from the 17% of 2022 to less than the 3%. And consider the situation at infrastructure level inside the Gaza Strip. The 80% of any kind of electricity generation was destroyed. The 90% of telecommunication infrastructure is not functioning properly. And consider that there is not any more agricultural production. Consider also that in August 2025, more than 500,000 people were facing famine, and more than 640,000 people they were facing hunger. Now, the data so far nowadays are controversial because nobody knows exactly how many trucks with food and non-food items are entering every day in the Gaza Strip. And the more problematic aspect is the fact that we do not know if the distribution is effective or not. So several people are still not receiving humanitarian assistance, and some of them they are still buying any kind of product in the so-called black market. So to make it short, Gaza economy not only collapsed, but basically disappeared. Now, the situation is in the West Bank is not much better in the sense that there is some resilience, but anyway, the economy is very fragile. There was a kind of 10% rebound in early 2025, but it is more a technical effect rather than a real growth. And consider that the economic activity remains almost 20% below the pre-conflict levels, and the unemployment rate is now standing around 30%, but it's much higher if we consider men with lower education in rural areas, or if we consider the Bethlehem district from where I'm speaking to you. Consider that Bethlehem economy is heavily depending on the touristic sector. So basically in Bethlehem, the unemployment rate reached the 45%, considering that there are not any more tourists and pilgrims that are visiting this area. Then it is important to highlight that the Israeli and the Palestinian economy were and are absolutely interconnected, till the point that before the 7th of October 2023, almost 200 Palestinian people from the West Bank, they were working daily in Israel in several sectors, in particular the construction and the hospitality sectors, but then even in the providing so many other kind of services. This number officially dropped to 24,000 people, only because Israel continue needing nurses and doctors in particular, and then because it allowed the staff of the churches to move from the West Bank to Jerusalem. Then consider, and this is really the worst part of the story, that in the mid-2025, we reached more or less 40,000 Palestinian workers that were back to work in Israel, but most of them are working without an official contract, and most of them are basically crossing the borders, illegally jumping, crossing the wall. Basically, on the Palestinian side of the wall, they have a ladder, so they can climb the wall, and on the Israeli side of the wall, the separation wall, they have a rope, and basically they jump. And there is a taxi driver that brings them to the construction sites or to factories or even to farms. This situation is tolerated by the Israeli authorities because they need manpower, they need workers. But you can imagine what does it mean for a person not to have anymore a contract, not to have any kind of support, and to illegally cross the border between the West Bank and Israel. On the top of everything, even the Palestinian Authority, which is the only recognized Palestinian government, is also suffering from the fact that they are not anymore collecting any deductions on the formal payrolls that were issued for the Palestinian workers in Israel. And then the Palestinian Authority, so the Palestinian government, which is based in Ramallah, is also facing the most severe fiscal crisis in its history. Consider that the Palestinian Authority was established in 1994 as direct consequence of the so-called Oslo Accords. And since that time, according to an annex to the Oslo Accords entitled Paris Protocol, the Israeli government is collecting on behalf of the Palestinian Authority any kind of tariff revenue related to import and export of goods. And consider that these revenues reached over 450 million shekels, that roughly per month, which is roughly 120 million euros. And consider that since May 2025, the Israeli government froze those funds as a kind of retortion. And practically speaking, that this means that the Palestinian Authority is not able to pay the salaries of the civil servants. And I have to give you this important figure. In the West Bank, there are 658,000 civil servants out of a population of 3.2 million. And in the Gaza Strip, 137,000 employees out of, let's say, 2.2 million. Now, for sure, those numbers are not feasible, but the main reason why the PA cannot pay the salaries and reduced the salaries over a 50-60% of their value, it is because the Israeli government doesn't transfer this huge amount of money to the Palestinian Ministry of Finance. Practically speaking, this crisis caused a limitation on all on the delivery of any essential service that you have in mind, in particular in the healthcare system, in the educational system, and in general to the social protection. Consider that children who are attending public schools are going to school only twice a week, and 3 days a week they should attend classes remotely. But you can imagine what does it mean to have access to a good internet connection in the middle of nothing in the 2/3 of the West Bank that are still under occupation. We have a big issue even in terms of access to medical care services. And consider that when I say that any civil servant doesn't receive a proper salary since at least May 2025 means that we are talking about teachers, police officers, judges, all the categories that you have in mind. So if this issue will not be sorted out soon, the APA might faces big issues, not only as an institutional paralysis, but even eventually as there would be even the possibility that it will implode for the simple reason that it will not able to provide any kind of support to the civil population. And continuing talking about important and negative factors, consider that even the banking sector is under a significant and extreme stress because the Palestinian banks are continuing accumulating a significant amount of physical shekel cash, so basically the notes. But then the Israeli banks, they have to guarantee for those big amounts. Basically, they have to correspond digitally the same amounts of the physical shekels that are collected by the Palestinian banks. There is a kind of agreement between the Israeli banks and the Palestinian banks. What is happening in the past 9 months is the fact that the Bank of Israel is not anymore waiving the Israeli banks in having relationships, business relationships with the Palestinian banks. This legal waiver was, a way to protect the Israeli banks on in case of any, harmful transaction that they might made by mistake. So this technical issue is now creating a lot of problems because if the Israeli banks will stop corresponding their account, the accounts of the Palestinian banks, basically the Palestinian bank system will collapse, and people will not have even the small amount of savings that they tried to accumulate, and they will not be able anymore to receive the remittances from their relatives abroad, and any institution will not be able to make any payment.
Sorry to jump in. Just wanted
Yes.
to let you know that you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you, dear. I will speed up. Now, of course, there is a bad and negative impact even on the main social sectors. So in Gaza, 2/3 of the hospitals are not functioning. There are so many diseases, including the polio, for example, and in general, the 80% of children in Gaza, they don't have access to school. And as I told you, in the West Bank, most of the children are going to school only twice a week. Those long-term disruptions might cause negative consequences that might be irreversible for the children, in particular in terms of malnutrition, trauma, and the possibility to have a decent life. The poverty rate reached almost the 40% in the West Bank, and basically we can say that in Gaza all the households can be considered poor. In the West Bank, the private sector still is partially resilient and adaptive, and consider that the 97% of the West Bank firms, officially it is still open, but of course all the businesses, they reduce the business hours, they cut any costs that they could, and most of them are resisting because they are family businesses. Now, what we can do to at least mitigate the bad consequences of this huge crisis? Well, of course, we need a real peace process. We have to end the hostilities. We have to start a real peace process. and we have to establish the conditions to understand what will happen in the transition period in the Gaza Strip, and then eventually what does it mean to build a concrete peace that eventually will also foster the establishment of the Palestinian state. Practically speaking, of course, Israel should give back the money to the Palestinian Authority. In a way or in another, the Palestinian banking sector should be protected. The private sector should be supported, even through external financial support that should be eventually provided, even through the foreign public aid. And then we have to continue counting on the Palestinian Authority government, because so far this is the only legal authority which is recognized by the international community. So, in a few words, the crisis is very deep, but recovery, it is still possible, and recovery anyway goes through the urgent issue of providing to fulfill the basic needs, and then any long-term solution, fortunately or unfortunately, will be based only on a political agreement. And then, of course, it is important to protect institutions. It is important to protect international organizations and NGOs that are anyway providing humanitarian assistance to the population. And all of us, even from an ethical point of view, we have to rebuild the hope for the Palestinian population. Thank you so much. And I am available for any questions.
Thank you so much, Luigi. We can now open the floor for questions. So if there's any questions from the audience here, and I also invite people joining us online to write questions in the chat.
Yeah, so I would open to one question now, and then at the end as well, after Tara, not to take too much time for Tara.
So any questions? So maybe, here. So we have one question from the audience. Let us know if you can hear.
Hello, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Out of ignorance, again, after this event, I feel so ignorant. But how the money market works there? Israeli has a different currency that Palestinian cannot access, or how? If you can give us some information about how the currency works.
Yes, dear. Consider that in Palestine, the Palestinian Authority adopted the currency of the occupier. That's the reason why I was talking about the new Israeli shekel, which is the Israeli currency that it is used also in Palestine. Then at the same time, the public administration, but even institutions like Bethlehem University or any other university in the West Bank, are paying salaries using the Jordanian dinar, because they don't want to accept officially the fact that they have to use the currency of the occupier. So basically, the Palestinian bank system has two accounts. And any financial statement is elaborated either in Jordanian dinars and also in shekels. But at the end of the day, the Palestinian bank system and the Palestinian Monetary Authority are operating even internationally using only the Israeli shekel. And that's the reason why all the Palestinian banks are backed, supported, or in any case, they have a correspondent bank in Israel, because this is the only way to be part of the SWIFT system and any other international bank system. So that's the reason why the two economies are super interconnected. And that's the reason why, from my local point of view, to me, it is very difficult even to, eventually try to avoid to buy certain agri-food products, or even to avoid to have an HP printer, for the simple reason that Israel de facto occupied even the Palestinian economy, till the point that if you go to a grocery shop or to the supermarket, sometimes you don't have an alternative and you have to buy an Israeli product.
Yeah, I have another question on water. I remember we had a small conversation the other month about how potable water and the water market functions. Can you quickly elaborate on that? I mean,
Yes,
where
yes.
does water come from, and if there are imbalances across the two nations?
All the Palestinian natural resources are controlled by the Israeli authorities, which means that the Palestinian population in the West Bank is buying its own water from the Israeli authorities. Okay? And the way how to control those springs and other natural resources was through the construction of the wall. Because and that's the reason why we cannot consider the wall as a defense barrier, for the simple reason that it's, the wall was utilized basically to annex all the areas of the West Bank that were considered strategic by the Israeli government. So that's the reason why in Bethlehem we have a huge shortage of water, for the simple reason that water comes from Jerusalem, from the Israeli Water Authority, and the Israeli Water Authority is the one that decides how many cubic meter to send to Bethlehem or to any other Palestinian city. Then at the same time, it's forbidden to dig wells. Consider that it's illegal to dig for more than 5 centimeters. And there is a completely total dependence even in terms of electricity, because the Palestinian electrical companies are buying electricity by the Israeli companies, and Palestine is the only it's a strange place, because here the production of clean energy through photovoltaic panels, it is not incentivized, for the simple reason that there is this kind of agreement between the Palestinian electrical company and the Israeli one. So basically, there is a political commitment not to make Palestine independent in terms of resources and of course even politically and all the other aspects that you can consider.
Thank you so much, Luigi.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you.
Okay, so last but not least, we have another speaker joining online. Professor Tara Van Ho, who is an associate professor. Oh, she's here. She's an associate professor of law at St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio, Texas. Her presentation will be focusing on the international legal expectations on states funding the reconstruction of Palestine, on both Israeli and Palestinian authorities, and on business actors receiving economic development opportunities. So again, Tara, thank you so much for being here today. Again, you will have 20 minutes for your presentation, and then we will follow with some questions. So the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you. And apologies, my little one stayed home with me today because she's not feeling well. So you might see her hands randomly wander into the video screen. I'm going to try to make sure her head doesn't also wander there. I'm just going to...
No problem.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Giuliani. and to the entire Rebalance team for organizing this and for allowing me and facilitating participation via video. I'm just going to share some slides as well.
Yes, so RIT will be sharing the slides, so let's just wait for them to show up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you want me to hide my screen? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, let us know if you, yes, great. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to talk really about the reconstruction of Palestine following the end, following this period of the Gaza conflict, but I will also touch on the West Bank issues as well. And really what I want to focus on is the challenge, which is how to establish sustainable peace and respect for human rights, given the economic devastation in Palestine and the need for significant reconstruction. So if we talk about Gaza, and Professor Luigi just went over some of this, we had 70,000 killed. We need $53 billion in USD for recovery. There's been $15.8 billion in housing damage. 1.5 million people are in need of emergency shelter. 90% of the population is displaced. Fewer than 14 hospitals are partially functioning. 97% of schools were destroyed. And the economy is at 13% of its 2022 strength. And when we move on to the West Bank, and I don't really like keeping the two areas of Palestine separate. Thank you, baby. Because ultimately it is one state, it is one territory, but unfortunately the economic realities for historical reasons have been distinct. So in the West Bank, we have seen over $170 billion lost from the occupation between 2000 and 2024. These numbers all come from the United Nations, by the way. About $76 million has been lost just between 2023 and 2024 due to settler violence. The 18.8% of the GDP was lost in 2023 to 2024, and that equals 17 years of economic growth.
Sorry, Tara, to interrupt. Can you please show your slides on a full screen?
Oh, is it not? Sorry, it was showing on full screen for me. So
okay, it's not showing full screen for us.
Okay, I'm not.
Now I think it is almost. Try again.
See, is it working now?
No.
Try to go view.
Is it working now?
No, for some reason we see your slides, but not in the full screen mode. So try to go to view and do it from the top.
Who's that?
Baby. To see your
Otherwise, it's fine. We can. Otherwise, it's fine. We can see them. I mean, just you didn't click on the next slide, so just. But now we can see them.
You should be seeing a green slide now.
Yeah.
Called the Trump answer. Okay.
We see the red one, like the one with 107.8 billion US dollars, and now we see the Gaza Strip.
Okay. Let's see. Is this working now? Have you seen a green slide?
No.
Okay. I'm going to
talk. Yeah, now it's green. Now it's green.
Okay. So the Trump answer to this is the peace plan that we're currently operating under. That plans to return aid immediately to the January 2025 agreement standards, which were already suboptimal and really outside of what's appropriate for long-term sustainable economic or human growth. There's no Palestinian leadership allowed in Gaza for an indefinite period of time. The Trump peace plan would require amnesty for Hamas, as well as the withdrawal of Palestine from the ICJ and the ICC proceedings, so all mechanisms of accountability. It would replace Palestinian governance with both an international board of peace and an international stabilization force. And then the US would facilitate a dialogue to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. There's no mention of where the money for reconstruction will come from or what the terms will be, but we do have hints from Trump's own statements that his plan is to turn Gaza into a beautiful resort. And within that, we only see vague reassurance of movement towards Palestinian independence and full respect for Palestinian sovereignty. The problem with all of that is that there's a great deal of opportunity for making money from the reconstruction of Palestine, and we aren't seeing any of the underpinning preconditions necessary to ensure that that financing and the reconstruction is sustainable and actually respects human rights in the long term. So international law has already faced this similar issue, notably with the push for Syrian reconstruction. Around 2017, 2018. I'm sorry. They all decided to come in at the worst moment. So just take the dog. I'll take the child. Okay. So we face similar issues. At the time, it was actually Europe that was pushing for the reconstruction of Syria as a way to bring refugees from Syria back to the homeland and to get them out of Europe. And so there was a deep push for starting reconstruction even before the end of the conflict, and even before what we've now seen as a transition within Syria. There were three main concerns then and now. The first is preventing financial support and rewards for those that were complicit in past human rights and humanitarian law violations. It is really deeply concerning that those who were actually engaged in issues of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity could also be making money at the end of the conflict from those violations and from their involvement. There was a need to ensure accountability for the past violations of human rights, humanitarian law, and international criminal law. We've already heard from Chiara and Michelle about how many of the businesses that we're seeing involved in Israel and Palestine have been complicit in violations of human rights, humanitarian law, and international criminal law. Those businesses should be, and the economic actors behind them, the business leaders, should be held accountable for any criminal actions that they were involved in, but as well as any violations of human rights or humanitarian law that they caused or contributed to. And then the third concern is that we need to make sure that any transition does comply with existing international legal standards. And so that requires actually really embracing international law as a framework by which we rest and situate the peace process. In 2018, to address these concerns, there was a group of eminent jurists who issued a statement on 10 principles for reconstruction in Syria. These principles were not actually derived from soft law the way that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights were. Instead, they're intended to be a restatement of existing international law. That doesn't make them hard law in their own sense, obviously, but they're a reflection of those hard law binding obligations that we already know in international law. I'm going to focus here only on a few key points from the principles, which are of great concern for Palestine. And I'm going to compare them to the Trump administration. So you should see a blue box that has the principle on it, and then I'll show you the green box that has the Trump peace plan. So principle 1 says that financial or practical assistance must not undermine human rights protection. And by this, what we mean is you shouldn't be facilitating human rights harms. So you shouldn't be facilitating ongoing forced displacement of individuals who are entitled to refugee status or who have been displaced by the previous conflict. It also shouldn't be rewarding those individuals who were complicit in the past.
Sorry to interrupt again. We don't see the slide with the principles. Okay, no, we do.
Okay.
Green on the left.
Yep. In the blue box is a principle. In the green box, you should see the Trump administration's plan, which says that it's going to condition aid on the peace agreement, and that peace agreement itself undermines human rights, including the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. So the Palestinian people were supposed to be entitled to a state that's under the Oslo Accords, but it's also under a general principle within human rights law. And by delaying again the recognition of a Palestinian state, and also removing Palestinians from governance within Gaza, this peace agreement fundamentally undermines self-determination. But there's also a serious risk that in the reconstruction efforts, we see people who have already been displaced, redisplaced, or their restitution and right to return to their homes delayed even further. Another principle is baby, I need you to be quiet. Another principle is Principle 8, which says violations of international criminal law, humanitarian law, and human rights law must be credibly and effectively investigated, prosecuted, and adequately punished. And you heard a little bit about this from Michelle and Chiara already, that this is an ongoing obligation within international law. There was a question during the question and answer period with Michelle about whether or not states could withdraw from the Genocide Convention. And they can, that's absolutely possible, but they would still then be bound by what we call customary international law. Now, this is a little bit of a complicated concept for some people who either aren't lawyers or don't have a background in international law. But customary international law is a law that develops when states act in a particular way and they believe that those actions reflect law. We already talked about how we don't have a legislative body for international law. And so what we're really looking at is trying to make sure that when we try to suss out law in those circumstances, when we try to assess law in those circumstances, we're looking at what states have done, how they've practiced themselves, and what they themselves believe the law to be. And these violations of the Genocide Convention are still going to breach customary international law, even if a state withdraws from the treaty itself. And with that comes this obligation, this ongoing obligation to effectively investigate, prosecute, and punish individuals who are responsible. Traditionally, this is focused on the warring parties. So in this case, it would be focused on Hamas and the IDF, but it does have broader implications and does include the responsibility of states to investigate, prosecute, and punish business leaders who were also complicit in the past violations. So businesses and business leaders who facilitated, as Caterpillar did, the destruction of homes in Gaza and in the West Bank, those who have facilitated monitoring and oversight in a way that breaches human rights, and those that have provided military equipment despite the accusations of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. All of those businesses should be part of the investigation, prosecution, and punishing process. Amnesties, unfortunately, within the Trump administration, it's planning on providing amnesties to all of those who are responsible, meaning that the Trump peace plan doesn't align with the existing international law, and it undermines the long-term efforts to ensure the reconstruction of Palestine facilitates peace. The fourth principle, I skipped a little ahead to the eighth principle because it relates to that first principle. But there's also a fourth principle that says that relevant parties must engage in human rights due diligence before each new reconstruction project. And Chiara already discussed the fact that human rights due diligence is an essential part of a business's responsibility to respect human rights. And as we continue the reconstruction process, human rights due diligence needs to become a central component of the reconstruction process, approval process, identification process, and ongoing development process. So all of that needs to really think through who is going to be harmed, who's going to be impacted, and what are those impacts going to be? How can we mitigate negative impacts, and how can we facilitate long-term reparations? Baby, I need you to be quiet. Unfortunately, in the Trump peace plan, there's no mention of how the reconstruction will take place. And even more worrying is that it doesn't talk about how it will be funded. And this raises a lot of concerns because we do know, and I'm just going to be very honest here, that there are corrupt forces in multiple governments that are involved in the reconstruction of Palestine, my own included. So we need to be careful to adopt preventative policies and practices that can be implemented to combat corruption as part of this. I have deep, grave concerns that that's not going to occur in this administration. And what that can do is ultimately undermine not just human rights. So corruption is recognized as being related to numerous human rights violations. but it undermines the long-term peace and stability. Corruption was also at the heart of people's discontent for a lot of authoritarian leaders. It creates deep problems within a democracy. And in a situation like Gaza, it has the potential to sow long-term discord and hostilities. So there are deep reasons for concern, and preventative policies and practices have to be a part of the reconstruction process. Principle 10 talks about how throughout the reconstruction process, particular attention has to be paid to gendered and intersectional harms. But unfortunately, the Trump peace plan makes no mention of children or women beyond a prisoner swap. There doesn't seem to be any recognition within the peace process that actually what we're talking about is something that has disproportionately harmed women and children in Gaza. Not exclusively so. Obviously, men have been killed. Obviously, men are starving. But there are gendered and intersectional harms, and the reconstruction process to make sure that it doesn't exacerbate those harms and facilitates an economy that also facilitates peace and stability for Palestinians, that needs to have an intersectional lens to it. And we need to be thinking through how we can facilitate long-term development of women's economy within Palestine. So moving forward, and this echoes a little bit some of what Professor Luigi said, which is we need to really reframe the current agreement from the Trump administration. It's not a peace plan. First of all, it's a ceasefire plan. Second of all, it's not built on principles of sustainable peace or respect for human rights. It's not being done in compliance with international law. And the consequence is that it's not going to facilitate long-term peace or stability. It's also potentially going to get some of the same actors that were involved in the abuses of human rights. It's going to reward them for that. And it could also implicate them in further abuses moving forward. So we need to start insisting on international legal conditions and standards that are integral to peace as a part of this reconstruction process. We need to guard against corruption and the potential for rewarding those that were complicit in the violations. The individuals and companies that were involved should not only not benefit from reconstruction efforts or contracts, but they really need to owe reparations and start facilitating reparations payments to Palestine, which I realize is a little idealistic and a little removed right now from the potential, but it is something that we need to keep an eye on and keep pressure on. And then finally, we need to start paying attention to those gendered and intersectional harms and really create an economy in Palestine that facilitates women's development and their inclusion in the peace process. So that is everything that I wanted to cover. And again, I apologize for the disruptions.
Thank you so much, Tara. Perfect timing. Okay, so we can open the floor for questions.
Yeah, while we get questions from the audience, I have one. So when you mentioned at the end that the same actors, I mean, I suppose you were referring to economic actors that will benefit from the reconstruction are also those that have contributed negatively to the conflict. Do you refer to a particular sector, to a particular set of actors? And I'm asking also if, Chiara and Michelle wants to jump in on this question, or even Luigi, of course.
So for me, it starts with the arms trade. It doesn't end there. So any of the businesses that have been involved in the military-industrial complex and have facilitated the war crimes are part of the economy that needs to be paying reparations and that should be excluded from contracts. That includes businesses like Caterpillar that are otherwise often essential to construction projects. It needs to then continue on to businesses that are involved in facilitating the settlements, which are war crimes themselves. Chiara already covered that. And then outside of that, it gets a little bit more dispersed. So there are a lot of different actors in the economies that could facilitate or could be triggered by that responsibility.
Luigi, yes,
Elisa,
thank you.
if I may, no, thank you, Tara. You were great. In a few minutes, you you gave us, you gave us a good picture of what is going on. And I want just to recall and add a couple of other information. Consider that nobody knows what will happen next, for the simple reason that now the CENTCOM, the U.S. Army Command for the Middle East, established a new military base near the city of Ashkelon, where they are revitalizing the idea of having a civil military coordination program in order to provide humanitarian assistance and start planning about the future of the Gaza Strip. But when we say Gaza Strip, nobody knows how the territory will be divided, considering that so far we have a green area, a red area, which is still in theory under control of Hamas, and the yellow border. Then at the same time, they are trying to establish this peace committee that so far is composed by 21 countries, including Italy. And basically, this peace committee should supervise the reconstruction process. But nobody is saying one word about the transitional period. So basically, nobody knows what will happen to 2 million people in the meantime. And then, third, there is also the Egyptian plan to ask the Palestinian Authority to implement the reconstruction plan in the Gaza Strip. That's the reason why nobody knows what can happen in a month's time, and nobody knows what will happen in the next 30 years, for the simple reason, as Tara was saying, we do not know who will pay for the reconstruction, who will pump the 80, 90, or 50 something, as you were saying, $billion that we need to reconstruct, or to give back dignity to the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip. And on the top of everything, we are in the hands of Trump, because the European Union doesn't have any political plan. And in this big situation, please don't forget that Israel, for sure, wants to maximize the profit, any kind of profit in terms of reconstruction. This is what happened after any war in Gaza, and I want to recall the last one in 2014. So, and consider that Israel is controlling all the borders. So whatever will happen only if the Israeli government will give the green light to proceed.
Any comment or question from the students? No curiosity? I will have like thousands of questions, but limit the question to.
I also have thousands of questions for both Luigi and Tara, but I would like to ask you because, of course, I know Tara very well. We are friends, and I know that she's worked on transitional justice before, whereas Luigi is based there in the region. So I would like to ask you both, because basically the idea of responsibility has been erased from this plan. Responsibility, transitional justice, reconciliation, truth. These are all concepts that don't really come into relevance in this plan. So I would
define transitional justice, because it's not obvious for everyone.
Yeah, basically a process, and I know that basically this is not even a piece, so perhaps it's even too soon even to talk about transitional justice. But after a conflict, a large-scale human rights violation of this kind, a society needs to be reconstructed. It needs to transition away from the tragedy, basically. And there are forces that have an entrenched hatred against each other, social forces in communities. There is an issue of reconciling communities. There is an issue of punishing the perpetrators, of redressing the people who have been harmed. Otherwise, there is no moving on from this situation. And of course, as I was saying, it's a bit too soon perhaps to talk about transitional justice when we have basically a ceasefire plan. But I would like to ask you, like, on this premise, no, if these are the shaky pillars on which we are discussing a possible ceasefire or peace, is it possible to truly have transitional justice, a true reconciliation in the area, or are we just preparing for the next tragedy, basically?
Yeah, good question. No, it's not possible to have true transitional justice in the current situation for a couple of reasons. The starting point is obviously this isn't a sustainable peace plan. Second, the conflict, this isn't the first time that we've seen a ceasefire agreement. It's not, we've actually had a true peace plan in the Oslo Accords that wasn't realized. This conflict is going to take a lot for there to be the preconditions for true transitional justice, including the current administration in Israel needs to leave. I would suggest also the current administration in the US needs to leave, but I can't see that happening in the next couple of years. The other problem is that transitional justice is predicated on a commitment to the rule of law, and we don't have within Israel right now the kind of accountability mechanisms that would be necessary for holding the IDF forces accountable. And if you take out that accountability process, then the rest of transitional justice becomes very fragile. Victims want to see accountability at the end of a conflict. This has been true in every conflict that I've worked on, and that's, we're talking dozens here. They want to see some sort of accountability that goes alongside the reconstruction efforts. And this idea that you can sort of push aside the justice component of it and hope that eventually everything will be fine anyways, it hasn't ever worked. Not just in conflict situations, but also in authoritarian regimes. So Argentina, it was 20 years after the end of the junta when people were still clamoring for the kinds of accountability and reparations that were appropriate. So you need to have that as a precondition. And then you also need to have some effort at facilitating reparations for victims of the conflict. And here that would mean requiring Israel and the United States to account not just for the really clear quantifiable harms of death and destruction of property, but also for that absence of economic growth, for the devastation in terms of the withdrawal of money from the Palestinian economy over decades. And nothing about the current situation tells me that they're ready for that. And so when you have none of those kind of underpinning preconditions there, everything that we're seeing right now is fragile. And unfortunately, I'm in the camp that believes that we are just waiting for the next tragedy, that we are in an intercessionary period that could be even more devastating the second time around, because we've now seen a government hone its practices, be accused repeatedly and quite seriously of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, and widespread and systematic human rights violations. And not only do they deny that reality, but they don't seem to care about the consequence of that. They don't care about the moral stigma of that, which is a shocking reality given Israel's history, that that's where we're at. And that means that if they don't care about what they've already done, then next time those systems are in place to make it even worse. And that's, for me, quite terrifying. I'm sorry, that was a very disturbing answer.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Luigi, if you have anything to add.
I completely agree with Tara for the simple reason that the conflict is not over. The ceasefire is not real, and the new political elections in Israel will take place in October, November 2026. So basically, this government still can do a lot of things. We really don't know what will happen with the south of Lebanon, and if they will continue bombarding the south of Lebanon in order to defeat Hezbollah. We really don't know what will happen with Syria, considering that they occupied a more significant portion of not only on, beyond the Golan Heights. So basically, for this government, this is the right moment to get whatever they had in mind. We don't know what will happen in terms of annexation of the West Bank. Bethlehem area could be annexed tomorrow, for example. The same might happen with the Jordan Valley. And then the big issue is that Trump never proposed a peace process. Basically, in order to start even thinking about peace, you should bring all the parties at the same table and grant the same dignity to all the parties. It never happened. And we have to consider what happened with the Abraham Accords during the first Trump mandate. Basically, commercial agreements were much more important than any kind of political agreement in the Middle East. And we have all to remember that Saudi Arabia was about to sign a commercial agreement with Israel, and the only reason why MBS didn't do it is because of the 7th of October, the massacres of the 7th of October. Now, Saudi Arabia promised Trump that in case Trump will be able to establish a Palestinian state, Saudi Arabia is ready to normalize any kind of relationship with Israel. Now, what does it mean to establish a Palestinian state if there is no continuity between the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem? That's the reason why it is important to say occupied Palestinian territory and not territories, just for the simple reason that we have to assume that those free territories are part of a possible state. And then Israel was able to build 714 kilometers of this separation wall that is long 714 kilometers. The wall was built also on the Jordanian border, meaning that any Palestinian state will be established inside the Israeli state. The Palestinian state will not have any border. There will be no access to the sea if the Gaza Strip will continue being occupied or under siege or whatever. There will not be an airport. There will not be the possibility to have any basic elements to think about a real state. And then on the other side, the Palestinian population doesn't believe that the Palestinian Authority can be transformed in the basic structure of a state. So basically, the Palestinian population is abandoned. And it is important even to consider that the priority for the majority of the people is to have a decent life. Civil and political rights, they will come after. I'm sorry to say it, my heart is broken. But at the end of the day, the priority is to fulfill the needs. If we are not able to fulfill the needs, it is impossible to promote and to guarantee the whole basic human rights that all of us have in mind. So having a decent life, thinking about the future, giving a future to our children, it is much more important than go and vote or having a Palestinian citizenship. I'm generalizing, guys, I know, but please consider that the situation is really, really bad. And whoever has another chance is leaving the country. That's the reality. And we here at the university, we are doing our best to convince our youngsters that still there is a hope. But it is very, very difficult to convince them.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is also very interesting. Also being there, you have first-hand experience with the situation. I would like to thank everyone here today for joining and for giving their time and knowledge to share with our students. And so thank you very much. I think we need to leave it at now because we are beyond the time that has been allocated to us. Thank you again, Luigi and Tara. We keep in touch, and thank you, Chiara and Michelle, for being today with us. And thank you for the students to participate and also to have asked some questions. The topic is really complex. I know some of you may not have a strong basis for understanding the full story, but definitely this is a super important dimension of understanding international businesses, how they handle such complex situations, and the Palestinian one is particularly complex, but there are many other cases around the world where the business is facing this kind of challenges, but is also part of the problem. So we need to be aware of these double sides and double face of the business and be able to manage it in the future much more carefully than we do today. So thank you again for being today with us. And I think we can close the streaming. Thank you. Possiamo chiudere lo streaming?